hmm Before we jump into our topic today, which is around boundaries and the narcissistic mother, I just want to ask you a little about how you got into the work that you do.
Um, Really because of my own dysfunctional childhood, my mom was an alcoholic. My parents were 16, 18 when they're married, 21 and 23 with four kids. So yeah, children raising children. And my mom ended up being an alcoholic. My dad was beat to death as a kid. He never hit us, but he was pretty cold and shut down. And so my childhood was just a mess and my life was a mess. Addictions and um, married a narcissistic sociopath and who was physically and verbally abusive. And then um, she did what's called parental alienation and, um, you know, really just lived a life against myself.
Mhm.
And luckily for me, the first counselor I went to, I was 21 years old. So I don't know why, but I guess I knew there were problems. So I was always looking for solutions. But it wasn't until my late 30s, through the divorce from that first wife who was abusive. That's when I finally met some, because one thing I've learned is what counselors, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists get taught in school is just to diagnose and prescribe medication. They're not taught how to heal somebody. So unless a therapist or psychologist has decided to do a ton of research and investigation outside of what they learn in school, they really can't help people. And luckily, I met one of those. And he said 13 words that changed my life when I got finished telling him about, a bit of my marriage and life story and stuff. I summed it up with, I was 38 years old and I said, Mike, I don't know how to be a man. And he said these 13 words. He said, Kenny, when I was in your shoes, I went and became an expert. And
Mhm.
that clicked. And from that moment on, if he suggested a book, I read it, a class, I took it. And as I began to become more aware of my childhood and my own actions and how the pain from my past is what created my attraction to somebody like that. All of a sudden, I started to get a sense of, safety and not feel so powerless, and my life started to get better, and that just continued. And so, he was the one who I'd been seeing him for about a couple months, and I'd go to this men's group, and which was run by another counselor in his office, and I'd walk in, and he'd go, "I heard about you," and I'm like, "What do you mean?" And just things I was piecing together in the group, and how I was then helping others, and I'd only been seeing him a couple months, and I walked into his office for my appointment. He said, "You have a gift. You need to come work for me." I had left school to play hockey, and he said just back then you just needed a degree of anything, and he's like, you need to do this work. Thank God I didn't do it back then because I
Mhm.
still had a long way to go. But after my second divorce, that's and I figured some things out beyond what he taught me, and that's when I pieced things together. And I started as I was doing all the research for decades, I kept seeing this gap in the process and thought, I must be wrong. Well, I realize there's a lot of things that I now teach and talk about nobody's teaching and talking about. And if you don't know it, you won't get to the other side of these problems. And that's when his message hit me. I was like, oh my God, maybe I do need to start helping people, and maybe this is what I
Mhm.
was meant to do. And so yeah, 10 years ago I started, this whole process and writing books and teaching all the things I've learned.
Excellent. Yes. And becoming an expert is the best way to heal. That's what I did too. I have a very similar story to you. I had to leave the therapy behind after 20 years on and off. Didn't work. And then I just realized there's a connection between my childhood trauma and my adult self-sabotage, and I need to find out what that is. And I, same as you, just researched education, just immerse myself in it like a full-time job And that was how I got to healing. So I can relate to your story quite a bit. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah, so we're here talking about boundaries with the narcissistic mother. And so I'll just ask you, can you tell us why boundaries are so difficult when you're the adult child of a narcissistic mother?
Yeah, because if you grew up with a narcissist, there were no boundaries.
Yeah.
So, I guess an analogy would be, um, say you grew up in Russia and someone demanded that you speak English. You have no clue. You wouldn't understand anything. Well, when you grow up with a narcissistic mother, you grew up learning Russian. You didn't learn English. You didn't learn boundaries and consequences. You didn't learn what it's like to be safe. Um, you didn't learn what truth was. Everything was deception. Everything was manipulative, both covert, meaning hidden, or overt in your face. And you don't know up from down, down from up. And so how could you have any sense of external or internal boundaries? It just wouldn't be possible because you were raised to speak Russian. And so the concept just wouldn't, you'd just be like, what do you, that's wrong. That's not right. It should be this way. Like that's the feeling is, even if you knew you grew up in dysfunction, when you see functional boundaries, it would feel, really cold or uncomfortable. It wouldn't feel right because, our brain and body seeks to repeat what it's already experienced, even if it's bad for us. It's what feels normal. That's why, like I talk about in my first book, the difference between our trauma gut and our true, authentic self gut feeling. Almost everybody on this planet thinks they're following their gut feeling, but all they're doing is following the feeling that was created from their trauma because it feels like the right thing to do. And,
Mhm.
so there's a lot of what are called skews. Like, guess the best way to say it is a person growing up with a narcissistic mother would look at this wall and they'd say, "Oh, that's painted red."
Mhm.
That's what they see. And it's like, well, can't you see the yellow? Like, what do you mean yellow? That's not yellow, that's red. That's how they view
Yeah.
the world. They can't see certain things about themselves or about others because reality, truth was so skewed. And so it's almost impossible to have functional
Mhm.
internal and external boundaries when you grow up in an environment like that.
Yeah, I love that explanation that it is like a different language, like a foreign language.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can really relate to that. And unfortunately, the setting boundaries is not only hard with your mother, it's hard with everybody. And do you have insight into why that is? Like, why are boundaries hard, with everybody, not just the mother?
Yeah. Well, because that gets back to attachment. As a child, we have two needs. The first one is attachment. Physically, we will die unless we physically and emotionally attach to another human being. That was discovered. I think I always get the Eastern Bloc country confused. It might have been Poland where they had a bunch of infants and they just left them in their cribs and they all died because nobody would connect with them. And so that's when we learned that, to survive, we need physical and emotional connection with another human being. The second thing we need is the pursuit of our authenticity. This is our inherent power, our own morals and values, needs and wants, negotiables and non-negotiables. We get to decide what our reality is, what our truth is, what we want to pursue in life. Well, just think of how almost all parenting is, even if it's not a narcissist, parent. They demand you adopt their view of the world, their morals and values, their needs and wants, their negotiables and non-negotiables. So do you see what gets set up? I have a choice. I can pursue my authentic power, my authentic self, but if I do, what do I lose? Attachment. I'll die without this. So what happens is the first boundary we lose is with ourselves. That's the
Mhm.
other thing, key thing to boundaries is almost everybody teaches it's about what you do with others. People who struggle with boundaries, the biggest person they struggle with is themselves. They don't even know how to say no to themselves because they were taught from an early age, You don't have a voice. You're invisible. Your morals and values, needs and wants don't matter. So they're constantly being boundaryless with themselves. And so they learn an adaptation of, wait a minute, I have to become a chameleon and be whatever you need and want so that I get attachment. And so whether
Mhm.
it's their career, whether it's their friends, whether it's their hobbies, the spouse they pick, they're constantly giving themselves away, dropping their authentic self, their own more. Most people don't even know their own. They think they know their morals and values, needs and wants, and negotiables and non-negotiables, but they don't unless you've done serious recovery work. And most people don't even teach how to find that. And so they've lost their own internal boundaries. They've adopted their parents, and then they just continue that process because of how our brain works. Our brain takes tremendous energy for our brain to do anything. 25% of all of our calories go to feed our brain. And so it has this incredibly smart way of conserving energy. It seeks to repeat what it's always done. It hates anything new. It doesn't, our brain doesn't know the difference between right and wrong, good or bad. What our brain is seeking is, have I done this before? So think of it this way. Next time, anytime you see, touch, smell, taste, or hear anything new, watch what your thought and feeling reaction is. You'll immediately get afraid and pull back. That's your brain going, no, 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 no. I don't want to do that work. That takes too much. No, let's just stay right here. Yeah, I know that every Thursday you come home and they beat you up and break your arm. But we go to the hospital and always come back. We're still alive. So what's it matter? We don't have to deal with it.
Mhm.
We can just keep doing this every Thursday because the brain is going, I'm still alive. This works because it doesn't know right from wrong, good or bad. And so that's why we keep repeating this pain against ourselves. Our brain is actually designed to sabotage us, to keep us stuck in that. Plus, it also creates this emotional chemical addiction within us to repeat that pain from the past. And so that's where the boundaries were lost initially because we've never taught parents how to parent effectively. We all have to give up our own internal boundary, and that's where we learn to be boundaryless, and then their behavior is completely boundaryless. So we've never seen it modeled, and children learn by watching their parents, not by what they tell them, but by watching them. And so if you've never seen it exhibited, how would you know how to set boundaries with yourself or others, or how to react to them either?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, how do we get out of these patterns, these repetitive patterns, and begin to set those boundaries with a narcissistic mother, those boundaries that are so essential to
Yeah.
our happiness and our authenticity and to some kind of relationship that works? How do we do that?
There are many steps to that process, too many to go through in just this short little thing, but I'll give you a couple
Yes,
things. One, we need to
even
know,
just a baby step would be
yeah,
great.
I'll
Yeah.
give you two things. How to figure out your morals, values, needs, wants, negotiables, and non-negotiables, and how to say no. Those are the two things. Most people Let's see, I'll start with needs and wants first. Most people don't know what they really need and want. So there's three questions you can ask yourself. The first thing is, what do I hate? What will I not tolerate? What can I just not stand in my life and I never want to experience again? Write that down. Then ask yourself, what's the opposite of that? Well, that tells you what you want. So for instance, I can't stand um, that um my husband smokes pot once a week. So what do I want? I want to be with somebody who doesn't smoke pot. Then you ask yourself, question number three, what can I control? This is the action plan. Once I know what I can't tolerate and what I want, what can I control? Instead of playing the victim and blaming them, and because a boundaryless environment, we thought we could change them. That's what we're always trying to do, is change the other person. I have no power over anybody else, but I do have power over myself. And so from this place, I can ask myself, okay, so what are my options? What do I have control of? Well, I get to decide who I'm going to be with. Is this pot smoking negotiable or non-negotiable? Is it possible I could plan something every Saturday night when he gets stoned to go meet my own needs and wants and go, I don't have to end the relationship. Maybe you do, maybe not. But so those are the three questions to figure out what your need, how to find your needs and wants, what you can't tolerate. The opposite of that is what you want. Then go put a plan in place and focus on what you can control. Stop trying to control them or change them and get them to be different. Because do you see, that's a narcissistic behavior. And that's what most people who grew up with a narcissistic parent, they then try and control because that's what they experience. And so we have to learn to set that boundary with ourselves that I don't have that power. The only person I can change is me. And if I don't like something, it's up to me to put a plan in place to address that need and want of mine. Morals and values people have mixed up. Morals are just what we think is good or bad. Values are what most people think are morals. These are our beliefs about something. So, for instance, I'm a recovering alcoholic. My mother was an alcoholic, but I don't really mind if somebody drinks. It doesn't bug me, as long as they, aren't a problem drinker, but I drink every now and then at dinner or whatever, big deal. So I don't see drinking as morally bad in moderation. Okay. Um, Now, if a person does any type of drug at all, I know everybody smokes pot now, can't stand it. You're
Mhm.
totally detached from reality. Like it's this lie that we're teaching people it's healthy and good for you. It's terrible. I see that as morally bad. That is non-negotiable. A woman could have everything I want in life. I'm done. No, if they resort to any of that. So we have to go through every area of our life. What do you think about finances? What do you think about intimacy? Do you believe in living with somebody before you get married? Or, how would you parent? What's discipline look like? Who's going to handle the finances? Who's going to handle chores and what chore? Like nobody has ever sat down and looked at every facet of life and gone, what's my value about this topic? And do I see it as morally good or bad? If you don't know what that is, you don't know what boundaries to set for yourself, and therefore say no to other people when they exhibit those morals and values. That's the most critical and the biggest gap. I talk about this in all my videos. I have 3 videos that teach you on my YouTube channel how to find your morals and values, needs and wants, negotiables and non-negotiables. It's on my codependence playlist. I preach you have to do that work. They have like 4,000 views. Nobody watches them. And I'm like, that's why you're
Amazing.
struggling. Like you have to,
Mhm.
because everyone's like, oh, I know what they are. I'm sorry, you don't. You just don't. Even if you didn't grow up with a narcissistic parent, because parenting by nature, the way we've all been parented, it strips us from knowing what that is.
Mhm.
So once you know what your morals and values are, needs and wants are, negotiables and non-negotiables, the other thing we need to learn to do is how to say no. And I'll give you a 5-step process with 2 magic phrases that works every time. The first thing to do, because we grew up boundaryless, our instinct is to say yes to everything
Mhm.
because we're afraid of the confrontation. We want to be nice. We don't want to upset somebody there. We got taught, remember our authenticity. Our needs and wants didn't matter. We only had value and attachment if we became whatever they wanted. And so we don't know how to say no. It scares the living heck out of us. Well, the first magic phrase that you use is when any request comes in, just say, let me think about it and I'll get back to you.
Mhm.
That buys you time. And the reason it's magic is, do you see that no matter what they say, you never have to explain yourself?
Mhm.
You don't have to drop back into that child position and explain why you're doing this. You just, so what do you mean you got to think about it? Yeah, let me think about it. I'll get back to you. Well, what is it you're going to think about? God, that's another great question. Let me think about that and I'll get back to you. You get to
Mhm.
stay the adult and buy yourself time. All right. Now, once you do that, you go off and ask yourself 3 questions. The first question is, if I do this for them, will I keep score that I did it? If I do it, will I ever throw it in their face that I did it for them? Or 3, if I do it, will I have resentment that if whether I get it back or um, feel something that it wasn't acknowledged? That's the problem with people who grow up with narcissistic parents. And really all parents, is almost every relationship I've ever dealt with, people are ending it because I did this for them and this for them and this for them, and they wouldn't do this. Well, what that tells
Mhm.
you is you did all of those things to manipulate and control, just like the narcissist, to get them to give you what you wanted. It wasn't freely given. You expected something in return, but you never even told them, hey, if I'm going to do this for you, I expect this. It was
Mhm.
silent because that's the deception. Remember, I talked about earlier the covert nature of growing up with a narcissistic parent. You don't even realize that when you're agreeing to do something, you're keeping score, you're going to throw it in their face, and you're going to have resentment unless you get what you want back from it. So if you think any of those things are going to happen, your answer has to be no. Unless you say, look, I'll do this for you, but I do expect this in return. At least then it's out in the open. But if you're not going to do that, your answer has to be no. But instead of saying no, you're going to use magic phrase number two. But before I tell you that, here I want to talk about why we don't say no. When someone says no to you, what do you usually feel about yourself?
Probably rejected.
Rejected. Where was the first time you heard no?
Well, I'm gonna guess from my parents.
And how did they usually say no? No. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Don't do that. That almost all the reason we all have a terrible reaction to no is we relive childhood where they shamed us.
Mhm.
And so nobody reacts very well to no because it drops them all back into the unhealed pain from the past and they relive it in that moment. And so what I teach is don't ever tell somebody no. Instead, use magic phrase number two is, which is, I've thought about it and it just doesn't work for me. And the reason this is magic is for two reasons. One, did you hear how my response has nothing to do with you? Like you said, when I asked you, what do you feel when no? You feel rejected. So you think when someone says no to you, you think it's an attack against you.
Mhm.
And that's how most people feel is, oh, did I ask something wrong? Was my request mean or something? They feel attacked. And that's why we don't say that because it's not about them. We've thought through it and we just realize it doesn't work for me. I'd rather not do this, probably for one of those three reasons, but we don't need to explain ourselves. Now, the next reason it's magic is because, again, no matter what they come back with, we don't have to defend it. Think of all the times we've tried to say no, and especially with a narcissistic mother, they're going to make us prove it to them, which we will never do because they will spin their lies and all of this and convince us how terrible we are for saying no. And
Mhm.
so you'd say to that narcissistic mother, Mom, I've thought about it and it just doesn't work for me. Well, what do you mean it
Mhm.
doesn't work for you? Let me think about that and I'll get back to you. Well, this is
Mhm.
crazy. Why won't you just do this for me? Well, because it just doesn't work for me, Mom. Well, don't you love me? Well, of course I love you, Mom, but this request just doesn't work for me. In other words, you get to stay the adult. You get to
Mhm.
keep your internal boundary. You get to allow them to have their request. You're not asking them to change. You're not sending any message to them. You're just communicating about yourself. And so this keeps you contained within yourself, not only how you feel within, but how you communicate to others. So those are two very quick, there's much more to both of those, but there's a quick glancing blow at two ways to start setting boundaries with everybody, really.
Yeah, that's very useful. Thank you for sharing that method because it's something really actionable that people can take away with them. And also to see how our boundaries are so tied into our values, and knowing your values in itself is not so simple as we think. So I
How do you
appreciate
know
that
what to
you
say
have,
no to unless you know what those are?
yeah, I really like that process that you took us through for knowing your values as well. Because it's probably much easier for a lot of us to think about what we don't like. That comes quickly, and then go to the opposite. And know that you can only control yourself. You can't control other people. I really love that. Thank you so much, Kenny. I'm really grateful for all this incredible information and very actionable advice that you've given us.